Okay. So actually, many of you maybe already know this or not, but I thought that let me introduce myself a little bit for those of you who don't know who I am. So I will say something that's almost embarrassing to say in this day and age with people of the younger generation is I worked for a company, a single company, Hewlett Packard, for 35 years. Can any of you guys imagine that? And then took retirement, so to say, and took over the helm of Lunar-G back in 2015. And I've always had a strong desire to have a lasting impact in the industry or something. And the success of the Vulkan API has been a very rewarding experience over the last 10 years in building these developers tools. So that's how I ended up at Lunar-G, but 35 years at one company, pretty inconceivable these days. So, and also, who is Lunar-G? How many people know who Lunar-G is? How many people think Lunar-G is part of Khronos or owned by Khronos? Good. All right, maybe I don't need to go over this slide, but we are an independent software consultancy. We're GPU software specialists, and in that we have been doing all the Vulkan ecosystem developer tools, that many of them that end up in the Vulkan SDK. We are the deliverers of the Vulkan SDK. I listed some of the projects that we work on, but this isn't exhaustive, but it gives you a pretty good sense of everything that we do. And I will have to say that this is all from sponsorship that comes from Valve, first and foremost, very generous, and also from Google. We do have some other sponsors as well. Okay, so every year, this is last year's data, we do a survey to the ecosystem developers. And when we do the survey, we do look at the results, because the results help identify pain points or priorities, will influence priorities, so things that we will work on in the ecosystem. So I thought I would just show you some of the highlights from the last year's survey. By the way, the new survey's out, and there will be a QR code eventually for you to all take pictures of and take the new survey. But anyways, last year's we had 258 respondents, and there was a strong mix of experienced professional developers developing for commercial reasons. Now, why do I say this? There is sort of a attitude that if it's a bunch of hobbyists just learning about Vulkan, their feedback's not as valuable. Well, the honest truth is I filtered the feedback from those and the commercial developers. The feedback is the same. But we have commercial developers taking the survey and giving us feedback on the ecosystem tools. These are some of the themes that we saw in the survey. People really rely upon the validation layer. More people trust that it doesn't have defects. And I think it is the most used debugging tool by application developers out there. A year ago, people really appreciated the synchronization validation that we provide. Artem works on this full-time, trying to keep it moving forward and fixing your issues. And people wanted validation for the timeline semaphore extension, the synchronization validation for that. There were quite a few complaints about how debug printf is used a lot, but it's not being maintained at the same level as the GPU-assisted validation. Error messages are very verbose, hard to read, hard to understand. Specific complaints about not enough validation of the ray tracing extension, and also specific complaints about, hey, stop shipping new extensions and no validation layer support for months later. Also, GPU crashes and timeouts, they're really hard to debug. We need a tool, a cross-platform tool. Those are some of the themes we saw last year. It's not exhaustive. From the shader compiler perspective, in that tool chain, it's actually interesting. GLSL to SPIR-V is still the larger population of survey takers, what they're using to get SPIR-V. I know everybody thinks it should be HLSL, but it is GLSL is the largest percentage. That to say, we know AAA game companies need good shader compiler options for HLSL. But, and they also are asking for better options for a shader compiler with improved HLS support or some next generation language features. So again, I'm bringing these things up. These were last year's themes. Through this presentation, you'll see how some of these have been addressed or on the path of being addressed. So we're paying attention as best as possible. So if you want to see all the details, the other thing I do is when you take a survey, I give you the survey results a month after I close the survey. And then at the end of the year, I take that same report, and throughout the report, I update it with, we did this, we didn't do this, et cetera, the end of year report. And I do this to emphasize, we are listening to what you say in the survey. Your data does not go into a black hole. And so this is, that communication back of what we're trying to do. So I did put the link in here for that end of year report, if you're interested in going and looking at that and seeing more detail. And again, time to get your phones out. The 2025 survey has been up for about a week, and I highly encourage all you guys, you are the audience of this survey, go take it, give us your feedback. Pause for a moment. Okay, so going on to the Vulkan SDK, who in here does not know what the Vulkan SDK is? Don't be shy. Oh, good, Charles. You and I need to have a discussion after this presentation. Okay. So everybody knows about it. You can download it from vulkan.lunarg.com, Windows, Linux, and Mac versions, as you see. And this matrix shows you many of the tools that are in the Vulkan SDK, all coming from open source repositories that exist in the Vulkan ecosystem. So how many people know why they're using the SDK? I hope these are some of the reasons why. We spend a lot of time getting everything to build and integrate to be the right versions, and then packaging it so you can put it on your system much more quickly, things installed in the correct place, built version of the Vulkan configurator ready to go. It comes from over 22 repositories. Each and every one of you could do that individually if you want, but I can tell you that we spend a week, probably 2 weeks of calendar time with each SDK, with multiple engineers working out issues to get this all to integrate. So I think we're saving a lot of people effort and trying to make this easier for the application developers. And also for those of you who may have companies that are concerned about what licenses are being put inside the walls of our company, we do also have a license registry that will detail for each binary in that SDK, what are all the licenses that contributed to that. All right, so last summer, so now I'm going to start talking about some of the things that have happened over the last year. So we added Windows 11 on ARM SDK last July. So now we have yet another platform that we're supporting, but there was some growing interest in this platform in the industry. We also added this copy-only option to the Windows SDK. There were people who say, I want to install this. I just want the files on my system, but I don't want the registry updated. I don't want to have to do things that I have to have administration level privileges. And so we did a copy-only option for that. And in July, we also removed support for Ubuntu 20, and we added 2404. So we always support the last 2 LTS releases. So we upgraded once Ubuntu 24 came out. And we also added iOS for the macOS SDK as a target for your Vulkan application development as well. So quite a few things happened last year in the validation layer. That is one of the repositories that has probably the fastest rate of change, I would say. But at any rate, Artem added validation for timeline semaphore because that was in high demand from last year's survey. That actually came out, I think, last summer. We also did a lot of re-architecting, refactoring, cleanup of the GPU-assisted validation portion of the code base. And as part of that effort, Spencer and Arno, who are both here, enabled debug printf can now be used simultaneously with GPU-assisted validation. all the core validation, so we always get feedback, more validation, more validation. So all core for 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2 has been completed. And all CPU-based ray tracing validation has been completed. Thank you, Arno. He's in the back room if anybody wants to thank him. It's turning a little bit red. That means that there's some pieces of the ray tracing that can't be validated until on the GPU. That is still to come. My suspicion is that won't start until you guys continue the constant cleanup and refactoring of the GPU-assisted validation code base. Continues to be a focus in the validation layers. All right, so other feedback is stop releasing extensions without validation layer support, or sometimes it takes months. I will say a new policy in the last year was implemented in the working group. Hope I can say this, Ralph. I'm going to say it anyhow. Extensions will not be released without validation layer support ready to go. And so one of the roles that I play in the working group is I help police that. The result is that when an extension is released, it still could take a week, maybe two, before you'll see the validation in the public. It's been developed in the private. They have to turn around and do the pull request to the public GitHub, but it will get in pretty quickly. And so we'll have much better and more timely support for validation layers of new extensions. SDK download rates, I always put this one in. It's pretty healthy, but this does not mean we have 36,000 separate users of the Windows SDK downloading every week. This is just number of downloads. Logins are not required for these downloads. And that was dictated very clearly by Valve, the largest sponsor of all this work, that there had to be no barriers to prevent people from feeling comfortable in downloading this SDK, no logins allowed. So this is just a relative number to give us a sense of what's going on with the SDK. It's way too early to tell what the trends are with Windows 11 on ARM, as you can see. Okay, some of the features that were added through the year. So this was actually a year ago, January, the extension VKKHR layer settings, it was included in the SDK along with a C++ library that enables programmatically configuring the layers from a Vulkan application. And all the layers that we put in the SDK, the validation layer, any of the layers from the extension layer repository, the profiles layer, and any of LunarG's utility layers, we all converted to using this API. And so now we are guaranteed consistent configuration behavior across the layers, whether you're doing it with environment variables, you're doing it programmatically, or you're using the Vulkan configurator. Before this, it was a little bit hodgepodge and quite confusing for folks. Okay, we added the crash diagnostic layer. So again, feedback was, gee, lost devices, hung devices, really hard to debug. We need a cross-platform layer tool to help debug this. This is done by some instrumentation and command buffers for completion checkpoints, a dump file. Later this afternoon, after Spencer, it's Spencer, then it's Ghavam. He's going to get up and talk a little bit more about the crash diagnostic layer and how to use it and how does it work. Okay, so last October, we added the Slang compiler to the Vulkan SDK. And this was in support of the Khronos Group Slang initiative that's basically going to oversee and advance the open source Slang shading language and compiler. And so it seemed appropriate to get it in the SDK as timely as possible. So this language and compiler has been supported by NVIDIA since 2017. So this initiative is building on about 15 years of research, development, and deployment experience that NVIDIA has had. And as such, Slang has been quite widely adopted in production projects across the industry. And I believe tomorrow afternoon, Shannon is on the agenda to talk more about Slang. There she is. I was looking for her. Thank you. Okay, so Compiler Explorer, widely used tool, allows developers to write code in various programming languages and see the resulting assembly code in real time. Spencer of Linergy, he took some time out and added support to Compiler Explorer for GLSL and SPIR-VOpt and SPIR-VVal and SPIR-VReflect, and most recently added Slang support to it. So I just wanted to shout out about the usefulness of this tool. Okay, so January was when the SDK came out that supported 1.4. Already seems like a long time ago, but I realize it was just a month ago. Some of the features, of course, 1.4 is fully supported in that. We did a few other changes as well. It used to be the Windows SDK would not install a Vulkan runtime. We left that up to only be installed by the IHV driver packages, but we decided it was time for the Windows SDK to force that install to a newer loader across Windows platforms. And one of the main reasons for this is frequently, like in Vulkan Configurator 3, which I will talk about, loader changes or bug fixes are needed to guarantee that that tool will operate correctly. So this is a way that we can get the loader up to snuff to what it needs to be, and not have old loaders on the system. Well, another thing that we did in this SDK is over the last 6 months or so, we had been working on defining an ABI for the GeoSlang validator. It didn't have one, which resulted in if a symbol went away, people would complain or whatnot, and you didn't have much flexibility in how you could really maintain that project. So we actually defined the ABI, and then this also resulted in our ability to deliver the GeoSlang validator as a dynamically loadable library. And we removed all 32-bit versions of layers to see who would complain. So far, nobody. 32-bit runtime is there, but it's just really hard for me in 2025 to conceive that people need to develop 32-bit applications. And we are constantly looking for things to stop doing because we need to get rid of that bloat so we continue to be agile moving into the future. All right, so we just released Friday, actually, the .1 SDK. We call them .SDKs. The key about a .SDK is that the header version does not change. So in theory, we can roll the SDK very quickly if the header version doesn't change. This one wasn't a fast one because we decided to throw in a little bit of new functionality here. Some of this we wouldn't have thrown in a .SDK, except that the key developer of Vulkan Configurator decided to crash into a barricade on his bike going down a mountain and break 7 ribs and puncture his lung, and it affected our schedules a little bit. So we delivered it in a .SDK. So there's 3 key things that we put in here. The first one is the portable ray tracing support and graphics reconstruct. And at the Linergy table out in the break area, Fabian is back there and he's demonstrating that for you. We'll tell a little bit more about that. One of the things that people complained about in ecosystem surveys is, man, that Vulkan spec, it is so slow to load. Please speed that up when it comes to our validation layer error messages. So we have a solution for that. And then Vulkan Configurator 3 was also added in the .SDK, which will be replacing the Vulkan Configurator 2. We'll talk more about them. Let's first talk about portable ray tracing. So what does this really mean? It means that there's tracking done at capture time and then translation done at replay time for device that allows for some device independence. And this is done for buffer device addresses, shader group handles, and acceleration structures. And this is useful for application developers because of bug reporting across different vendors that you can now do. But there's additional benefits that we will be able to realize more in the future. Some of the work behind the scenes that's doing this translation that Fabian has started helps support the very fact that Vulkan is becoming more and more GPU-centric, and we need lots of device-independent address translations. So Fabian wrote a white paper on what he did. I put the link to it here. And again, visit the Linergy table discuss it more with Fabian. He's certainly a lot smarter than me and can tell you more about what he's doing there. Okay, so back to those slow spec load times. I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, I can't even remember my age. Everything seems to be really fast and just yesterday. But when we build the validation layers to be included with the SDK, we have an option when we build them to replace so that the URLs that get put in the error message point to the version of the specification for that SDK, not just top of tree, right? Because the specification continues to evolve. We want it to point to the one relative to what the SDK is for. Well, when we did this, it pointed to the single file HTML. That's what we had 6, 7 years ago. Problem is, if you load that in your browser, chokes things up pretty bad. It's very, very slow, very frustrating. So what we did, Marty's been running a documentation project. Many of you guys know about this documentation project. It's using Antora to build a static website, in essence, of the specification and lots of other Vulkan documentation. There were 2 features we needed from that project. First of all, we needed the ability to not only build the top of tree, we want to build for a specific SDK version. And second of all, we needed some meta language inside those builds so that we could reference a VUID and have it go directly into the specification for that VUID. I got these things recently. This is what we slid into home base because last year at Vulkanised, someone asked me, when are you going to integrate this into the SDK? Literally, we did this just last week. So we just got it in time. So now what happens is from your validation layer, error messages from the SDK, if you go to that URL, it loads the Antora built version of the specification and it loads very quickly. And I deleted the HTML single file link from the SDK documentation. All right, Vulkan Configurator 3. This has been actually quite a bit of work that's been going on for a period of time. You learn as you develop an application what was good about it and what could improve, and this is, learning that and trying to put it into action. So Christoph is the primary engineer on this, and he made some key enhancements to this tool around improving the layers. They're loaded and how they're selected. You can have multiple versions of a layer, of the same layer. You can explicitly see what you're selecting, the layer version you're selecting by a configuration. You can have more control over how you order the layers, drag and drop user interface to it. The executables that you're launching from Vulkan Configurator, you can have multiple sets of options per executable. And there was more logging enhancements added that also aids in system diagnosis, because the Vulkan loader, if you has a lot of information, will tell you, what ICDs is it seeing, et cetera. And we're making this information more easily available from Vulkan Configurator 3. If this works, yes, it does. An animated GIF from Christoph, because he wasn't able to be here. So this one is demonstrating how you can create configurations for different versions of the validation layer. So it starts by duplicating a validation layer configuration, giving him 2 separate names. So I think 275 he wants. And this one, what does he want it to be? Latest. Okay. And then he goes and finds 275 version of the layer that he has on his system and enables that. And then for that 270 version of that configuration, make sure that that layer is associated with it. So this will enable you, for example, gosh, my application didn't have that validation layer error message before, did it? Oh, maybe it did, I don't know. Let me toggle easily between these 2 validation layer versions to see what I'm getting in A versus B. So that gives an example of type of change we've made to Vulkan Configurator. If you want to learn more about Vulkan Configurator, should I say it, Arno? He can run it for you at the Linergy table and talk about it. And she says, I have 5 more minutes, and I think I'm at the end. I have 1 more slide. And this is one of the most important slides. You guys should be very thankful for how this work is coming to you. It's from companies funding us. And I need to start out by saying Valve was the initial sponsor and the biggest benefactor of this ecosystem, and that they remain to be a very steady support of LunarG today. And they don't only fund that they personally want to use, they fund stuff that they know will be of interest to anybody and all in the ecosystem. So they're funding stuff they don't use, but they know other people use it. And they know it's beneficial to the Vulkan API to have these ecosystem tools. Of course, and I have to talk about Google because they do a lot of significant contributions to the Vulkan ecosystem as well, such as their Angle, OpenGLS to Vulkan, and much of the shader compiler toolchain. And they also provide some funding to LunarG, primarily Android focused, but we're helping with the Android ecosystem with some of our tool development there. And the rest of the companies here, all to various amounts, provide funding to us as well to help develop tools that all of you guys are using in the ecosystem. And that's it. Here's your actions. You can download the presentation, come to the table and get swag. I don't want to take it back to Colorado. There's a QR code for the survey. Please be sure to take the survey. Your feedback does matter to us. That's it. Are there any questions at all?
Well, firstly, just let Christoph know, get well soon. I should have him on the bounce back.
He's fine now.
Cool. The question was, what was the reason for being able to insert multiple validation layers?
What was the reason for supporting
You said
multiple
in
versions?
the configurator 3 that you can insert a layer.
He gave a validation layer because, again, like, for example, someone might be developing, the validation layers do change constantly, right? And someone on the previous version of the SDK may not have been getting a validation error, or maybe getting a validation error that now is going away, and they want to verify that easily.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think I misunderstood. So
Yes.
I thought you was inserting the same layer twice in a row kind of thing with different settings or something. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I don't have any question. I just have a couple of comments. First of all, thanks to LunarG and specifically Spencer for developing the validation for the device ignore commands at the same time as we were working on CTS tests and the extension.
Yeah, and I have to emphasize, this is for everybody. This is one of the big benefits of validation layer development going on at the same time that conformance test suite development's going on, because they're collaborating and giving feedback to each other, and it's making the specification better before it gets into your hands. So this is really beneficial.
Absolutely, yeah. And second thing, also thanks to, I don't remember who is working on synchronization validation, but it has helped me a lot to fix a lot of problems. So thanks for that.
Yeah, he's the one that's holding the fort right now because the rest of the validation layer engineers are here playing. So I'll give him thanks. Yes.
Okay, I guess
think
if no
we're
other
good.
questions, thanks to Karen again.